right, we'll get started. First of all, welcome. I'm Dee Dee Ruggles. I'm director of the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory. And I want to welcome you to the Modern Critical Theory lecture series held this year, for years past, on Tuesdays, always here in Greg Hall. Masks are encouraged, not obligatory, but encouraged, and we provide them at the door. So if you want one, go ahead and help yourself. For new students and faculty, there's always a cache of readings. You probably already know this, but it bears repeating. There's always a cache of readings to supplement the lecture, and the link is on the website. And if you write to us, we will give you the password. And with that, as we think about where and when the Modern Critical Theory lecture series occurs, we should recognize and acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Meami, Maskuten, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of Native nations prior to their forced removal, and the lands continue to carry the stories of those nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years, in some respects at cost of Native peoples. And so with that problematic history, we must, going forward, strive to become a vibrant and inclusive community, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. Well, I'm happy to see you all, and I'm excited as you are to hear the evening's speaker. I also hope that you will come next week to hear Professor Monica Jimenez from University of Texas, Austin, who will be giving her lecture on legal genealogy of racial exclusion, law, and the making of Puerto Rico. This week we have the pleasure of hearing about the current project of our colleague, Craig Koslofsky. Something I always love is to actually hear colleagues talking about their work, because I know you're brilliant, but it's really nice to have it confirmed, which I expect will happen tonight. Craig is professor in the Department of History with additional appointments in Germanic Languages and Literatures, the European Union Center, the program in Medieval Studies, and the program in Jewish Culture and Society. He has authored and edited numerous books. Among them, he is the co-editor of Kulturelle Reformation, Sinformationen in Umbruch, 1400 to 1600, which is cultural reformation, meaning in transition, something like that. Right. In 2000, he published The Reformation of the Dead, Death and Ritual in Early Modern Germany, 1450 to 1700. His third book was Evening's Empire, A History of the Night in Early Modern Europe. And this won the Longman History Today magazine Book of the Year for 2011 and was picked as one of the Atlantic's Book of the Year for 2012. So in addition to being erudite, I assume it was also very readable.
I think so.
They don't always go hand in hand, as we know. Most recently, he has co-edited, or not most recently, but recently, he has co-edited and translated A German Barber Surgeon in the Atlantic Slave Trade, the Journal of Johann Peter Ettinger, 1682-1696. That was just 3 years ago. And for that work, he was awarded an NEH Scholarly Editions grant. And then I was told that even more recently is this edited volume, Stigmata, Marking Skin in the Early Modern World, a collection of essays. We can actually pass it around since it's so pertinent to what you're talking about today. And then also, for those of you who know how to use Q codes, a link to a film.
A series of short videos. 8 short videos.
Also made, really stemming from this project.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
So I'll pass that around too. We need those back eventually. But I was saying that this afternoon Craig will present work on his new book, The Deep Surface Skin in the Early Modern World, 1450 to 1750, for which he received a Guggenheim Fellowship 4 years ago. And I should add that the unit is organizing a critical book lab to provide Craig with a critical reading of this manuscript just before it goes off to Cambridge University Press for editing. And I just mention that because if any of you have book manuscripts in the making and this interests you, there will be a call for applications this spring for the next round of critical book labs. So with that, please join me in welcoming Craig Koslofsky.
Well, thank you so much to Dee Dee and to the unit for giving me the opportunity to give this lecture to this larger forum. I'm delighted to do that. Thank you also for the land acknowledgement. Some of the sources I'm going to read today reflect the racist and dispossessive attitudes of Europeans toward Native peoples on this continent, as a matter of fact. And I thought it might be appropriate to mention that. Let me just advance here. I'm here to talk today about skin and epidermalization, and I'm focusing on a particular set of phrases or references from the work of Frantz Fanon, his references to livery, and I'm tying that to the early modern origins of whiteness. I seriously hope to persuade my brother, whether black or white, to tear off with all his strength the shameful livery put together by centuries of incomprehension. From 1952, from Frantz Fanon, Peau Noir, Masque Blanc, first English edition 1967, Black Skin, White Masks. Frantz Fanon, the Martinican psychiatrist, theorist, Algerian freedom fighter, offers profound perspectives on skin and identity in this work, Black Skin, White Masks. Surprisingly, he uses livery, an early modern form of dress, as a metaphor to open his analysis of the relationship between blackness and whiteness. And just for perhaps the non-early modernists in the room here, that's livery. That's a special uniform worn by servants of various kinds, increasingly restricted to lower social classes in the early modern period, to show exactly who they serve and to demonstrate both the luxury and wealth and color scheme of the master of the house, and also to show their role as a subordinate or a servant. So there we have a page wearing blue livery. We'll see another servant in livery a little bit later on. Fanon moves pretty quickly from sartorial references to livery to medical and biological imagery to articulate a condition he calls epidermalization, which is central to my approach to the history of skin. Though he's urgently concerned with the decolonization struggles of his own time, Fanon also references these centuries of incomprehension, gesturing toward the history of race in the pre-modern era, which is the focus of my work. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon is often described as grappling with or theorizing, quote, the problem of blackness. But Fanon himself describes Black Skin, White Masks as fundamentally, quote, an effort to understand the black-white relation, end quote. Fanon sees this relation as fundamentally situated and colonial. As a recent interpreter of Fanon explains, quote, by focusing on the relationship between black and white, Fanon undercuts the colonial pretension, the pretension of the white colonizer to full self-possession and self-identity. The colonizer is, on the contrary, not master of himself, but an effect of the colonial relation. He does not pre-exist that relation, but only comes into existence as constituted in and through it, end quote. So in other words, on a certain abstract level, Fanon is just as focused on the problem of whiteness as on the problem of blackness, because both are effects of the colonial relationship immediately in his century and of the longer relationship of blackness and whiteness stretching back into the early modern period. Fanon is, of course, concerned with the ways in which blackness and whiteness function very differently from one another, but his work can, I suggest, provide powerful insights into the history of whiteness in the longue durée. In fact, it does not take much effort to bring Fanon into dialogue with the early modern world. By looking back across the centuries of incomprehension, one can locate some of the fabric that makes up the shameful livery he evokes. In the first chapter of Black Skin, White Masks, livery appears for a second time as a metaphor for debasing and degrading representations of black people, constructed as a people with, quote, no culture, no civilization, no long historical past, end quote, and represented through stereotypes in the media, Fanon explains that, quote, the Negro must, whether he likes it or not, put on the livery that the white man has made for him. But by chapter 5 of Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon has moved much deeper into his account of how, quote, assailed at various points, the corporeal schema that he grew up with crumbled, its place taken by a racial epidermal schema, end quote. He moves from sartorial to medical imagery, from cloth to skin, to describe the experience of being fixed or objectified by the fact of blackness. Fanon created the term epidermalization to describe the reduction of an individual to his or her skin, itself a synecdoche for skin color. Fanon was, of course, concerned with a very specific kind of racial colonial epidermalization, which marked the skin of the subject as lighter or darker, thereby signifying the individual's race or racial mixture as a fundamental, indelible, heritable condition. This imposed exclusionary form of epidermalization arose from the very specific relationship between skin and society experienced and examined by Fanon, a relationship specific to the 20th century, but descended from the epidermalization formed in and for Atlantic slavery in the early modern centuries. Fanon experienced epidermalization as an active marking process, and it's this aspect of marking that I think can be particularly illuminating for the history of whiteness as well as for the history of blackness. He described himself as, quote, sealed into that crushing objecthood of the fact of blackness by, quote, the movements, the attitudes, the glances of the other, end quote. He saw himself as, quote, fixed there in the sense in which a preparation is fixed by a dye, end quote. Et l'autre par geste, attitude, regard, mais fixe dans le sens où l'on fixe une préparation par un colorant. Apologies. But Fanon's a medical man. He's a physician, a psychiatrist, and he's describing a very specific technique where a little bit of dye is added to a cell so that its subunits can be seen under the microscope. That's the fixing that's going on here. He describes his experience with a variety of medical and scientific metaphors. Already I am being dissected under white eyes, the only real eyes. I am fixed. Having adjusted their microtomes, they objectively cut away slices of my reality. I am laid bare. I see in those white faces that it is not a new man who has come in, but a new kind of man, a new genus. The sum total of being forcibly reconstituted as a living representation of the fact of blackness is termed by Fanon, quote, the internalization, or better, the epidermalization of this imposed inferiority. In my project on the history of skin, I see two ways to engage with the concept of epidermalization. Early modernists who read Fanon must ask, how can we write the history of the fact of blackness, as Fanon described it, as an active process of marking, fixing, coloring, and internalizing? This is the focus of my skin project, to explore the history of Fanon's epidermalization. And it's significant, I think you can see, that if Fanon used a biomedical technique, the fixing of a cell preparation on a slide with a dye or colorant, as a metaphor for his experience of epidermalization. The relationship between the fact of blackness and the rise of whiteness is an especially important question for early modern history. Scholars such as Rana Hogarth and Andrew Curran have written some of the history of the creation of the fact of blackness through early modern anatomy and medicine. Curran's book is called The Anatomy of Blackness. Alongside the history of epidermalization, I also seek to historicize the concept of epidermalization. Without diminishing the critical force of Fanon's use of the concept, is it in fact possible to understand epidermalization more heuristically and more generally, more globally? If we consider any fixing of the skin with social meaning through culturally and historically significant practices, such as tattooing, scarification, as epidermalization, we can produce a broader comparative category of analysis. In this broader sense, epidermalization occurs in a wide range of societies in which the marking of skin permanently signals essential social relations, inclusion, beautification, status, achievement. When the most important markers of social status, gender roles, life experience, and aesthetic expression appear on the skin Rather than on clothing or in a set of documents or through material culture, one can say the society in question is highly epidermalized. In contrast, medieval European societies were highly sartorialized, showing rank, nobility, profession, marital status, and so on through clothing, and policing sartorial display through sumptuary legislation. By focusing on the fixing of social meaning on the skin, my larger project explores both internal and externally opposed epidermalization in the early modern world. Scholars have established that in pre-colonial West Africa and in the Americas and in many other parts of the world, before and during the era of contact, skin marking practices, dyeing, tattooing, piercing, and scarification were widespread, inclusive, and aesthetic. Deliberate marks on African and American skin were signs of adulthood, bravery, beauty, or political affiliation. They connected people and displayed status. They offered protection against disease, against witchcraft, and other harms. In other words, these were all highly epidermalized societies. When the Europeans began to sail the Atlantic in the 15th and 16th centuries, they entered an epidermalized world of marked skin, positively epidermalized. They encountered societies organized by complex, deliberate, and inclusive dermal practices. This affirmative marking stood in sharp contrast to European penal branding, mutilation, and scarring. Europeans, for the most part, had inherited and expanded classical and biblical ideas of marked skin as dishonorable, punitive, exclusionary, and disfiguring. Marking the skin permanently indelibly brought shame. When a burning iron is put on the face of an evildoer, it leaveth behind a brand or stigma, as one Scottish minister explained in 1645. Here's my outline just to kind of show you where we're going here. Fanone's concept of epidermalization. And here's permanent dermal marking as stigma. This is the Quaker leader James Naylor branded on the forehead for blasphemy in 1656. Eyewitnesses say the bailiff who was charged to brand him on the forehead held the iron there until his skin smoked. This was the level of pain and humiliation that this guy had to suffer. And this is a form of penal branding, the most commonly done on the hand, or the French branded on the back of the left shoulder here. It was understood by Europeans as deeply dishonoring. They could scarcely imagine any form of permanent skin marking that reflected desirable social status or an aesthetic expression. Such marking would be honorable stigma. That's an oxymoron. Describing Native American tattooing, the 17th century authors such as the English physician John Bulwer, who's quite a assiduous compiler of travel accounts, he struggled to understand how, quote, men ingenious and free could affect such stigmatical characters as notes of bravery and ensigns of honor and nobility. So he's describing Native American marking, and he just can't understand how permanent dermal marking could be seen as ensigns of honor and nobility. Now, the Europeans did find a more familiar negative view of dermal marking in China and in Japan. In East Asia, Europeans noted the norm of unmarked skin and the, in their eyes, appropriate use of branding and tattooing for punishment and the singling out of criminals. European and Chinese observers alike noted the barbarity of indigenous Taiwanese tattooing in parallel 17th century accounts. If you want to know more about that, the chapter in the book on stigma that is being circulated right now is written by our own graduate student in history, Xiao Chen, and he's done the research on how Europeans and Chinese alike show up in Taiwan in the 17th century. They're coming from different worlds, but they both agree the indigenous Taiwanese people are heavily tattooed and it's barbaric and terrible. That much they agree on. But of course, the anti-dermal marking Confucians and the anti-dermal marking Christians on the other side of Eurasia, they're really outnumbered by the vast amount and widespread use of honorable dermal marking. Now, the Europeans did not simply observe a world of honorable dermal marking in Africa, in the Americas, or Southeast Asia. They learned from these practices and they began to imagine new relationships between skin and society. I want to take a closer look here at some of the kinds of honorable dermal marking that they would observe. Frozen up. I'm sorry, there's just not a lot going on here right now. We have any tech support here? Let's see. Yeah, I got the keyboard and the clicker and the mouse. Ah, there it goes. The mouse is doing it. Sorry about that. Okay, yeah, now we're back. Maybe something just went to sleep. Here we have the Quaker leader. Here's an example of honorable permanent dermal marking. This is a bronze head from Benin from the 16th or 17th century. It shows a defeated northern king with some scarification over his eyebrows, not Beninese or Bini scarification. So that's one of the ways you can see he's not Beninese. He's a king from someplace else. And then he has these cat whisker scarifications on the side of his mouth and coming down from something. That's also a sign that he is not from Benin, but rather a defeated king. He's got the royal hat and collar on. So this is honorable dermal marking. And the Europeans were beginning to learn from these practices that they saw, and they began to imagine new relationships between skin and society. What did Europeans learn about skin in the sort of global encounters I'm going to discuss in a moment? Well, I argue that Europeans encountered, transformed, and embraced epidermalization in this period. Their response to the highly epidermalized West African and American societies on the shores of the Atlantic began with incomprehension and curiosity, but ultimately produced black-white epidermalization, a heretofore unknown dermal practice. This hybrid practice was the basis to the Europeans' new relationship between skin and society. Skin, seen as colored, became the most important site for the display of one's status and identity, and European skin, which was marked as unmarked or white, stood at the summit of a new hierarchy based on skin color rather than on traditional marking practices. In my history of race-making, instead of emphasizing the agency of Europeans as creators of racism and creators of new ways of knowing skin through race and knowing race through skin, I show the impact of African and American ways of knowing and marking skin on European dermal practices in this dynamic period. Epidermalization allows us to approach human skin as a place where history is made, in this case, through the contact between Europeans and the wider world. In this case, revealing how early modern European investment in skin color appropriated and inverted African and American dermal practices in the service of new social and economic ends, such as Atlantic slavery and settler colonialism. And the easiest way to explain how I see white skin and whiteness in the world today is to consider the sartorialized Europeans concerned with who's wearing what, venturing out into the wider world in the year 1400, the year 1500. By then, they've encountered different people who on their skin have markings that show bravery, military accomplishments, beauty to be attractive to the other sex, protection against disease, protection against bodily harm, safety and protection in childbirth, a sense of general belonging that speaks for itself when the marks are seen. The people of their social unit recognize who they are. They see skin markings doing all this for all different kinds of people in the early modern world. No one society that they encounter is marking its skin for medical protection and protection against sorcery and to show beauty and to show bravery in battle and to show success in other stages and to show whether you're married or unmarried, mature or not yet an adult. But when you put all those things together, you have a worldwide repertoire of the benefits of dermal marking. Now, what's fascinating is if you ask yourself, particularly in a society like the United States today, what does white skin do for you today if your skin is marked as white in the United States? Well, it is in fact all the benefits that was given to marked skin in the epidermalized societies that Europeans encountered. If your skin is marked as white in this society today, you have a much lower risk of being killed by the police. If your skin is marked as white in this society today, you have a much higher chance, a measurably higher chance of having a healthy pregnancy and a healthy delivery and childbirth. If your skin is marked as white in this society, you're not contributing to the multi-billion-dollar skin lightener product industry, which is a global phenomenon primarily sold in the global south to lighten the skin of people. So the benefits of dermal marking that the Europeans encountered, they bundled and transferred into one new kind of marking, which pretends to be no marking at all, and that is whiteness. Atlantic slavery and settler colonialism were two of the primary directives or purposes for this. So the European understanding of human skin and its relationship with human society began to change in the 17th century as Europeans began to focus on skin and skin's color as the marker of human variety and race. We can see this new emphasis on skin color in a July 1676 letter from the renowned English physician and author Sir Thomas Browne to his son Edward, who was also a physician. The elder Browne suggested that his son should take notice of the cuticula and cutis of Negroes and examine it well, end quote, in order to investigate the physical basis of dark skin. This is Sir Thomas Browne, and this is his letter to his son Edward. His son Edward is trying to get into the Royal Society of London, one of the first and premier scientific institutions of the time, and he tells his son, you should start to look at skin under a microscope and try to figure out the physical basis of dark skin. This was important, Browne asserted, because, quote, a greater division of mankind is made by skin than by any other part of the body. And just to be clear what he's talking about here, he's not talking about smooth skin and rough skin or, soft skin and dry skin. He's talking about that is into white-skinned men or Negroes. So in 1676, in the year of Bacon's rebellion in this hemisphere, Browne called for anatomical research that would help inscribe the color line, help create this fact of blackness that was so urgently needed and so assiduously created in this period. So Browne's remark raises a fundamental question in the history of skin. How was this dermal greater division of mankind built up so that it could assert itself over the many other early modern conceptions of the body, human variety, and social hierarchy, like nobility versus commoner status, gender? So to answer this question, I'm working on this book called The Deep Surface, Skin in the Early Modern World, trying to locate the origins of modern conceptions of skin color and race at the intersection of early modern European, African, and American ways of marking and knowing skin. And I draw on the concept of epidermalization to do this. Let me try to give you an example now of how this argument might be developed with a reference to livery, because Fanon kind of produces it there. It's interesting, livery, not a super common word to be used in French in 1952 when Fanon is writing, but this is the term that he pulls out sort of as a phrase. So in this part of the presentation, I'll give some examples of how whiteness was fashioned from old cultural materials, such as livery, and new cultural products, such as travel accounts by Europeans describing new people and new places. Over the course of the 17th century, early modern authors expanded the scope of the word livery, and like Fanon's shift in black skin, white masks from sartorial to epidermal imagery to articulate the relationship between blackness and whiteness, livery developed from literal and figurative references to clothing and other things on the body to include references to non-white skin itself as livery. By tracking this development, we can see a key aspect of whiteness as a form of epidermalization. We have here a quotation from a popular poetry school book, the English Parnassus, from Joshua Poole, first edition, 1657. This was part thesaurus, part rhyming dictionary. If you had to crank out a poem for an assignment or maybe a love letter or something like that, or a love poem, this thing would have the rhymes and flowery phrases that you need. Livery appears in here as a gloss under the headword sign. So a sign is also, or could be a synonym with, badge, token, livery, cognizance, argument, witness. Down here a little further, symbol, crisis, signal, remonstrance, probate, hieroglyphic, emblem, or character. So the Oxford English Dictionary and other sources provide a range of kind of figurative uses of livery. 1563 sermon refers to love and charity, which is the only livery of a Christian man. And in 1661, Robert Boyle, a scientist, a natural philosopher much concerned with color, for example, the physical phenomenon of color, is writing a scripture gloss, and he refers to, quote, white, the livery of innocence, end quote. So the use of livery pops up in encounters and descriptions of people in other parts of the world. It's part of the bricolage that is brought together to start to create whiteness and to take old concepts like livery and fit them into new situations. So let me back this up for a moment here. The Hakluyt expedition, Elizabethan Englishmen heading to the Northwest Passage, try to find a way to China. 1576 is when it starts. We have an account from one of the ship captains, Christopher Hall, from 1576, about the native Baffin Islanders that he encountered on this voyage. And he described them relatively briefly as saying, they be like to Tartars. This is a sort of imaginary Central Asian, Mongolian kind of people that don't really exist in quite the way that the English people think they do. But he says, they be like to Tartars, with long black hair, broad faces and flat noses, and tawny in color, wearing sealskins, and so do the women, not differing in the fashion, but the women are marked in the face with blue streaks down the cheeks and round about the eyes. So dermal marking, and honorable, desirable dermal marking, always stands out to Europeans because they can't really understand how something like that would work. But he says that these folks have long black hair, broad faces, flat noses, and they're tawny in color. The first publication presents Hall's account in just that way, but when it's republished in 1613 by an Englishman named Samuel Purchas, who was a great compiler of travel accounts and a huge promoter of English Atlantic expansion, Purchas glosses and rewrites what Hall has said to produce a statement that says they had long black hair. He leaves out the reference to Tartars. That makes it too scary. They had long black hair, broad faces, flat noses, tawny of color, or like an olive, he kind of adds in there, parentheses, which neither sun nor wind, but nature itself imprinted on them, as appeared by their infants, and seemeth to be the general livery of America. So this whole sentence underlined in red here is just a gloss added in 1613 by the compiler, and the gloss is actually longer than the text itself. So nature herself has imprinted this skin color on the native Baffin Islanders. This is a resounding no to geohumorism. That means that their color is not the result of the sun or the wind, but it comes from nature themselves, and it appears on their infants. This evokes whiteness by considering a threat to whiteness. If the people there are tawny because of the sun and the wind of that area, then that's what will happen to English people if they settle there to mine or to fish or on their way station through in their attempts to reach China. It is instead nature itself that is there, and this tawny color is the general livery of America. It's not going to affect Europeans. Writing in 1578, another explorer who was on this same this same expedition into the Northwest Passage, Elizabethan explorer named George Best, first addressed these concerns about the relationship between skin color and region, what they call geohumorism. And he was among the first to use a newly developed idea of a biblical curse on Ham, son of Noah, which is based on a very twisted interpretation of Genesis 9. If Ham and his descendants were cursed with eternal servitude, which is kind of what you get out of the scriptural text, that meant that Ham's son Hus, or Cush, was also cursed. And according to Genesis 10, he settled in Africa. So by this extremely tendentious biblical interpretation, it is concluded, according to the curse of Ham, this was huge all the way up to the Civil War in the United States, that there is a Old Testament biblical explanation for the perpetual blackness and servitude and inferiority of African people. And this was a scriptural basis, had especially good credibility among Protestants. Thus, as Best explained, you can see that the cause of Ethiopian blackness is the curse and infection of the blood and not the distemperature of the climate. So once again, climate is not going to make you black if you travel through or live in African regions. Like Purchas, Best sought to convince English readers that the other skin colors encountered in the Atlantic world, whether tawny or black, were not the result of climate or environment. This meant that English people had no reason to fear becoming like Americans or Africans. The European body, which they began referring to sort of as a closed body, a new early modern sense that the human body is or should be closed off, it would not be transformed by life at any Atlantic latitude. These claims necessitated an explanation for American tawniness, and African blackness that trumped the standard geohumoral understanding, which is your color is shaped by where you live and its climate and the food that grows there that you eat, et cetera, et cetera. Instead, we have a general livery of America as tawny. And this theme is picked up by a couple of other authors. But this view of the inherent skin color of Native Americans as being tawny was by no means uniformly accepted in the 16th or 17th centuries. As noted above, Sir Thomas Browne, as well as learned men across Europe and in its colonies, considered the question of the causes and transmission of skin color to be both important and unresolved. The prevailing counter-opinion about Native American skin color, voiced by some English and many French authors, proposed a very different relationship between livery, skin color, and native skin, asserting that Native Americans are born fair, born white in some of the sources, and become tawny or olive only due to indigenous cultural responses to their environment. Marc Lescarbot is one of the first to report on this in 1618, a French compiler. He writes of the native people of America, quote, "They are all olive-colored, or at least tawny like the Spanish. Not that they are born such, but being most of the time naked, they rub fat on their bodies and sometimes anoint themselves with fish oil to guard against mosquitoes, which are very troublesome not only where we were, but everywhere in this new world and in Brazil as well." I even think it's humorous to think this guy's complaining about mosquitoes in two hemispheres of the Americas. But the logic is people all over the Americas anoint themselves to guard against mosquitoes, and that's why all over the Americas they've produced the same tawny skin color, even though they're born fair. We have a love sonnet from an English nobleman, Lady Mary Roth, who talks about how the Indians are scorched by the sun, just as her unrequited love leaves a mark in her heart, but the Indians are visually marked in their skin by the might of Phoebus, the sun god, whom they adore and present themselves to naked. William Wood was one of the first English people to comment on the English settlements in New England, 1634 publication. Their swarthiness is the sun's livery, he says, for they are born fair. So this is maybe a clever play on words, but also a sense that they are tanned by the sun because they are naked, and it's their cultural status rather than anything physical about them that causes them to become tan. There's more French evidence of tawniness, and once again, it's all referred back to they rub their bodies with fat or grease and with paints of various colors, and they mix these in order to become more beautiful. So it might seem, and in a traditional kind of history of racial thinking or a history of European expansion, it might seem that those who claim the Amerindians were naturally tawny, born that way, with skin color, with their tawny skin color as a general livery of America, and those who argued that in fact native people are born fair, as you can tell by their children, and they only become tawny because of cultural practices. They made themselves tawny. That would be presented as a clear opposition, two opposing ways to explain different kinds of skin color. But these opposing claims about native skin converge to help construct whiteness, because they both seek to assure Europeans coming to America, whether English settlers or French missionaries, that their skin color will be safe in the New World. The tawniness of the people all around them in America is either the product of nature, inherent to native people, or the result of practices such as nudity, getting a lot of sun, tanning, applying oils and pigments to the body. So European whiteness is invoked by these potential threats to it, but it will not change. And the references to infants' generation and heredity, you could see as another piece of this kind of bricolage of race making that is put together in this period. So these two seemingly opposed explanations of Native American and African skin color signal two other aspects of the history of whiteness. After all, what is the conceptual distance between describing Amerindians as creating their own tawniness by rubbing and coloring their whole body with protective oils or coloring, and Europeans creating whiteness by coloring their bodies as white in their scientific treatises, in their comparisons with other skin color? That's what Europeans are doing here. They're producing a full all-over body marking like that they observe and describe. It's a model for full body whiteness. It's not something they can admit they're doing, and this is part of the cognitive dissonance at the core of whiteness. They're observing American dermal practices as a template for imagining whiteness. The other explanation for American skin color is one which works very well with whiteness, which is that they are all hereditary. Both the tawniness is hereditary and not something that would strike Americans, Europeans if they lived in America, and whiteness can also be understood as hereditary. So scholars today might even agree with the English and French claims that the coloring of skin begins at birth and apply that to questions about whiteness. After all, if you say that everyone is born white, and then some peoples color themselves and transform themselves, that is in a way raises the question of what if no one is born white? And in fact, everybody creates a skin color through cultural practices. That's what they're saying about the native people, and that's what they are in some sense doing themselves. So I see a certain kind of repression or denial, because as Europeans are learning how powerful and significant skin marking is all over the world, they are both adapting and adopting it by marking themselves as white and also denying that they are marked at all. They're furiously marking themselves as white while proclaiming white bodies to be truly unmarked. This creates a pretty tightly wound and tense state of whiteness. By the latter part of the 17th century, in the poetry guide that we have here, you can see how skin is being glossed. And this is quite a profound change here to describe skin as the body's alabaster sheath, or the native shirt, or the body's oldest clothes. If we go back to the 15th century, we can find a completely different understanding. The interior and exterior of a person are one, shaped by their complexion, which affects temperament, hair and eye color, personality, and skin. That's the ancient and medieval understanding of complexion. It's a bodily phenomenon, not a skin phenomenon. The key to the humoral theory in complexion is balance. Balance is the foundation of the doctrine of humors, and so no one body color should predominate in this 15th century or medieval view. The most beautiful of all women, the Virgin Mary, was described in a 15th century sermon as, quote, not simply dark, nor simply red, nor just white. For any one of these colors by itself brings a certain imperfection to a person. Mary was a blend of all complexions, partaking of all of them, because a face partaking of all of them is the most beautiful one. Not long after that, we go from the 15th century to the 17th century, we have skin as the body's alabaster sheath. And the understanding of whiteness that is expressed here is also expressed pretty vividly or visually in a painting from Anthony van Dyck, the portrait of the Marchesa Elena Grimaldi Cattaneo from 1623. This is I think the last major sort of source material that I'll present or discuss to you here. This is the imposing Marchesa Cattaneo stepping out onto the terrace of her Genoese palace, shielded from the sun by a liveried African servant or slave with a bright red parasol. The Grimaldi Cattaneos are the best connected people in Genoa. Her brother later becomes a cardinal, just to kind of give you some sense of her social status. And this family is deeply entangled in the slave trade with the Spanish Empire. So Genoese merchants are moving Mediterranean goods into the Atlantic and moving enslaved people from Africa to the Spanish Empire, and then the colonial goods like sugar back into Spain and into the Mediterranean. So that's the kind of the material context around this woman. But if we look at the 1623 painting, we can get a visual overview of kind of how whiteness is evoked by what threatens it, or accentuated by what contrasts with it. And there's really not much in this painting that isn't evoking whiteness, either by what threatens it or by how it can be highlighted through contrast. The parasol is American cochineal red, the most valuable dye stuff of the time. So having a huge silk parasol in that color displays tremendous wealth. But after all, the parasol is there not just to display wealth, but to protect the fairness of the Marchesa from the sun. The importance of the blush in this period is to contrast and to show the fairness of the skin and its ability to blush, which is increasingly seen as a significant contrast with the invisible blush of darker-skinned people. From Shakespeare on, there's a lot of discussion of who can visibly blush and who can't. The study of African skin is really fundamental to knowledge about human skin. The first skin that's examined under a microscope by Europeans is African skin, because it's the constitution of African skin that fascinates them, and they're trying to figure out how to derive the difference of African skin from the unmarked norm that is white skin. You can see here this African boy is also dressed as in some kind of a gold livery there, and obviously this is a world of slavery and trade. Orange blossoms are in her right hand. This is a symbol of chastity and a reminder of the role of gender and heritability in the making of this whiteness. This is no longer something that could come and go depending on where you or your child or your father lived for some period of time, but rather something that is profoundly heritable. And finally, there are a lot of reasons why black was the most fashionable color of the 16th and the 17th century, but among those many reasons, its ability to set off the whiteness of one's skin certainly can't be discounted. And that's why she has this enormous black silk garment, some red cuffs, a gray ruff or collar. So this begins to give us a kind of visible example of what the body's alabaster sheath would look like and how whiteness is sort of evoked by what threatens it. So these discussions of livery that Fanon kind of playfully brought up here, wherever I've looked in French, English, German literature, I've found no examples of livery to refer to white skin, only to Native American skin or African skin. So there are no references to white skin as like the livery of the Englishman or something like that. Colored livery could be a metaphor for African or American skin, but not for white skin, because after all, livery is understood as a badge, a token, a hieroglyph, a marker, and white skin was defined as an unmarked original state. So creating one's skin color, that's the European process that I'm trying to describe here. And it takes us back to the first comment or quotation from Fanon here. Take us back to the very start. Fanon denounces a shameful livery put together by centuries of incomprehension. As I've suggested in this talk, the concept of livery was indeed one of the many ideas that was used to model, evoke, and construct differences between Europeans, Asians, Africans, Americans in the Atlantic world and beyond. The French and English authors surveyed here used livery to evoke differences that were cultural or the product of nature, depending on their agendas and their observations. But in all cases, they framed African American skin as marked and European skin as the body's alabaster sheath, an unmarked, naturally white surface. The contradictions inherent in this conception of whiteness are referenced, I would argue, by Fanon's call to overcome centuries of incomprehension. Fanon's understanding of the black-white relationship reminds us that black and white are, in his thought, in some ways parallel, mutually constituted. I seriously hope to persuade my brother, whether black or white, to tear off the shameful livery put together by centuries of incomprehension. What kind of incomprehension is Fanon talking about here? Is he referring here primarily to black and white, to the inability of black and white to understand one another? I would argue that he's referring here primarily to each pole's inability to comprehend itself. So this statement doesn't denounce mutual incomprehension, as if there's a pre-existing black and a pre-existing white, then they met and failed for centuries to understand one another. Instead, through this clinical study, which is what Fanon calls black skin, white masks, he diagnoses a deeper inability to comprehend oneself due to the alienating effects of forced epidermalization. Self-understanding for Fanon is clearly the message or the mission of this text, but the logic of mutual social and psychological constitution of black and whiteness has therefore also been unable to comprehend itself, its origins. And this, I think, is a real challenge for historians of the early modern period or the modern period. We think we understand what whiteness is. You don't have a stack of books called How the Jews Became White, How the Italians Became White, How the Irish Became White, without feeling like you understand what whiteness is. You understand its benefits, its parameters, its genealogy, who it excludes. But if we take Fanon seriously here, the mystification that's involved in the creation of whiteness is just that, mystified for everyone, not just for people who are not marked as white. So this is a side of epidermalization that really hasn't been studied. As I said, scholars have written on the history of the creation of the fact of blackness. They've looked at the anatomy of blackness, medicalizing blackness, the work from our colleague Rana Hogarth. But to go further into the history of epidermalization and whiteness, and really for a white scholar to turn the focus to whiteness, I suggest it's time to consider the epistemologies and ontologies created by these same early modern Europeans. Specifically, I'm thinking of influential philosophers from Descartes and Locke to Hegel and Kant, as evidence not of the fact of blackness, but the anti-blackness of facts. The fact of blackness gets us to the condition that black people are in, which Fanon describes. But the converse of that, the blackness of facts, or the anti-blackness of facts, refers to the creation of what Fanon and his successors have described as, quote, the zone of non-being in which blackness exists in modernity. As we have seen in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon argues that racialized subjects must first seize access to ontology, storming the fortified heaven of being itself. That's a very fancy phrase to say that racialized subjects have to seize access to ontology and storm the fortified heaven of being itself as being is constituted in modernity. But of course, that can also be very simply expressed with the three words, Black Lives Matter. That's demanding an ontology for a kind of person whom, according to Fanon's writings and his followers, are deprived of an ontological state. They don't fit into the Hegelian dialectic because of the way modernity is constructed. So a history of whiteness, or the anti-blackness built into modern ontology and epistemology, would be a corresponding agenda to the one Fanon lays out in Black Skin, White Masks for the black addressees of his work. This would look at centuries of white incomprehension of itself. And I think this is what the scholar Akile Mbembe is doing in his influential work on the Critique of Black Reason, which was published in 2017. In the last three chapters of my book, The Deep Surface, I show how the ontological marking of skin with the fact of blackness, or with its white shadow, is the apotheosis of early modern forms of desirable social dermal marking. So my chapters examine the fact of blackness, European and colonial fantasies of legibility, early modern anatomy, biology, and optics as forms of dermal marking, but inspired by the discussion of anti-black ontologies from Frantz Fanon, from the Afro-pessimists, from Sylvia Wynter, and from Akile Mbembe, I'm also exploring early Enlightenment ontology and epistemology to move from the fact of blackness to the anti-blackness of facticity and being in the modern world as a consolidation of the theory and practice of race in the 18th century. Thank you for your patience.